In 1781, British troops besieged a palace to rob two women of a fortune they alone commanded. Their trial nearly destroyed the most powerful man in British India, yet history erased their names. This is the story of the Begums of Awadh, and how two women held more real power than any king in 18th century Hindustan, until an empire decided their story was inconvenient to remember. By the mid-1700s, the Mughal Empire was a crumbling shell. Delhi's emperors still sat on the peacock throne, but real power had scattered into regional kingdoms carved out by ambitious governors. One of the richest of these was Awadh, a fertile kingdom along the Gangetic Plain, ruled by a Persian-descended dynasty of Nawabs. And behind the marble screens of its royal households, in the world called the Zena, something remarkable was happening. Far from being a prison of silk and seclusion, the Zena was a command center. Royal women here controlled treasuries larger than the state's own budget. They held land grants called jagirs, taxed entire districts, funded armies of retainers, and negotiated directly with kings, generals, and foreign diplomats, all without ever lifting a veil in public. Two women in particular ruled from behind that curtain. The first was Sadrun-Nisa Begum, widow of Safdarjung, one of Awadh's founding Nawabs. Known simply as the Nawab Begum, she had inherited enormous wealth and influence, becoming the moral and financial anchor of the dynasty. The second was her daughter-in-law Ummat-uz-Zohra, remembered to history as the Bahu Begum, the daughter-in-law Begum, wife of Nawab Shuja-ud-Daula. When Shuja-ud-Daula died in 1775, custom and his own will dictated something extraordinary. Rather than passing his personal treasury to his son, the new Nawab Asaf-ud-Daula, he left the bulk of his fortune, reportedly worth millions of rupees in gold, jewels, and cash, directly to his widow, the Bahu Begum. In a kingdom nominally ruled by men, the single wealthiest person in Awadh was now a woman who answered to no one. This arrangement might have remained a private family matter, if not for the growing shadow of the East India Company. Asaf-ud-Daula, the new Nawab, had inherited his father's throne, but not his father's fortune. And worse, he had inherited a crushing debt, the cost of maintaining British troops stationed in his kingdom under the so-called subsidiary alliance. The British Governor-General, Warren Hastings, watched Awadh's finances collapse and saw, sitting untouched behind palace walls in the city of Faizabad, two treasuries controlled by women he considered irrelevant to statecraft. He was about to discover how wrong that assumption was. The crisis came in 1781. Hastings had provoked a rebellion in Benares by arresting a local ruler, Raja Chait Singh, and the revolt that followed nearly cost Hastings his life and his career. Desperate for money to cover the costs of suppressing it, and desperate to explain away his own failures, Hastings accused the Begums of Awadh of secretly funding the rebellion. It was a convenient story and a useful one, because it gave him legal cover to do what the company had wanted all along: seize the treasure of Faizabad. British forces, acting through the company's resident, moved on the Begum's palace. When the women refused to simply hand over their wealth, the British did not negotiate with them directly. They went after the men who protected their interests. The Begum's two chief eunuchs, senior officials named Jawahir Ali Khan and Bahar Ali Khan, who managed the treasury and commanded the palace guard, were arrested, clapped in irons, and starved in an attempt to force them to reveal the location of hidden gold and jewels. The palace itself was placed under armed guard. Under this pressure, the Begums were finally forced to surrender treasure worth well over £1 million, an almost unimaginable sum for the time, money that vanished into company coffers to pay off the very debts the British themselves had created. It should have ended there, a quiet act of colonial extraction lost among 1,000 others. Instead, it became one of the most explosive scandals in British political history. When Warren Hastings returned to England, he was put on trial before Parliament, impeached for corruption and abuse of power. And among all the charges laid against him, it was the treatment of the Begums of Awadh that captured the public imagination most. The brilliant orator Richard Brinsley Sheridan delivered a speech on the affair in the House of Commons that lasted nearly 5 hours, reportedly so powerful that members of Parliament wept, and at least one listener is said to have fainted from the emotional intensity. Edmund Burke, leading the prosecution, devoted entire speeches to the Begums, arguing that British soldiers had tortured elderly women's servants and violated the sanctity of their household. Conduct, he said, that would have been considered barbaric even by the standards Britain claimed to be civilizing. For a moment, then, the Begums of Awadh stood at the very center of British political life. Their names were read aloud in Parliament. Their suffering became a symbol used to put the entire colonial project on trial. And yet, when the impeachment ended 7 years later with Hastings acquitted, and when the history books of empire were finally written, these same women vanished almost entirely from the record. The historians who shaped the official story of British India, men like James Mill, who never set foot in the country he wrote about, reduced the Begums to a footnote if they appeared at all. When they did appear, they were rendered as passive, tragic figures, wealthy widows who had money stolen from them, rather than what they actually were. Sovereign political actors who controlled armies of retainers, negotiated treaties, issued their own seals of authority, and forced an empire to put one of its most powerful men on trial. The myth that took hold was a simple, useful one, that women in Muslim India, hidden behind purdah, held no real power and existed only as ornaments or victims of the men around them. It was a myth that flattered colonial administrators, who could claim to be liberating Indian women from a supposedly backward tradition, while ignoring the inconvenient truth that some of the wealthiest, most politically formidable figures in the region were women. The British themselves had been forced to negotiate with, bribe, threaten, and ultimately rob by force. The reality was far more complicated and far more remarkable. The Begums of Awadh were not the only royal women of their era to wield this kind of authority. From the Mughal court's own Nur Jahan a century earlier to the later Begums of Bhopal, women across Muslim ruling houses in India regularly held land, commanded loyalty, financed public works, and shaped the fate of kingdoms, often while never appearing publicly at all. Power did not require visibility. It required control of treasure, of loyalty, and of information. And by every measure, the Begums of Faizabad held all three. Today, the tombs of the Bahu Begum and the Nawab Begum still stand in Faizabad, quiet monuments to women whose fortunes once made a British governor-general tremble and whose mistreatment nearly ended his career. Their story survives not because empire chose to remember them, but because their suffering became too politically useful for Parliament to ignore. The myth of medieval India's silent, powerless women was always a convenient fiction. The Begums of Awadh proved that behind the veil was not silence, but sovereignty. And it took the full weight of the British Empire and an act of Parliament just to take it from them. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more untold history every single day. See you in the next one.